Why do we always have to clean up a mess the grunts can't handle?
Tell me about it. I just want to deliver the package and get out of here.
Yeah, sooner or later.
Out of all of the bizarre new plot points introduced in Opposing Force and never referenced in the series again, Race X has to be the strangest. From a gameplay perspective, it makes perfect sense. Gearbox wanted new enemies, so they added new enemies. But we don't know much about them. We don't know how they fit into the greater picture of this world. We hardly know what their goals were.
Friend of mine.
What is that, Doc?
I don't know. I've never seen that species before.
It's okay, sir. I can take him. Well, I got hit pretty.
Oh! No! I don't want to die!
Those poor bastards.
That's what I want to focus on for this video. Since the creatures are all fairly standard mechanically, mostly just mirroring enemies from other shooters of the time, we're going all in on lore here. Where did they come from? Where did they go? Why haven't they ever returned? All this and more on today's episode of Cascade. First of all, it'll be helpful to define what Race X is. Opposing Force introduced a number of new creatures to the game, and most are part of Race X. The relationship between Zen Forces and Race X was left ambiguous on purpose to let Valve or Gearbox sort it out in future games. That's why you never see Vortigaunts and Shock Troopers in the same place at the same time. Instead, both companies ignored them entirely for all of their future work on the series. The name Race X itself never appears in the game or manual, and the strategy guide I bought for this video only refers to them as this alien race. Yeah, that's right, I bought a book to fact check shit because we couldn't find an archive online. Anyway, the Race X name comes from sources outside the game, like emails with developers, which is where a lot of information about these creatures comes from. The species included in Race X are the Pit Drone, Shock Trooper, Voltigore, Pit Worm, Shock Roach, Spore Launcher, Gene Worm, and these flying particles called Sprites. Yeah, they're alive, apparently, and they get their own entry in the strategy guide. I think the next thing we should establish is what each of these creatures' roles are in the invasion of Earth, so let's quickly go through them all. Pit drones are shitty little things that suck and are bad. They're the lowest of the low on the hierarchy, they're annoying as hell, and they couldn't even get their own AI, reusing a lot of code for the bull squids. And this is reaching into pre-release territory, but early versions of the drones had big chunks of metal on their heads that implied that they were being mind-controlled. I'm assuming this was cut because someone remembered the plot of Half-Life and didn't want to copy everything from it. Next we have the Shock Trooper. You can tell they're the soldiers of the group because they act just like them. Really, it's more recycled AI, right down to the communication systems. Fun fact, the Spore Launcher is actually an infant Shock Trooper. The Shock Trooper is the poster child for Race X, the one people think of the most, well, Race X-like of the lineup. And its weapon is our next entry, the Shock Roach. It's a big ant that shoots lightning and seems to require a connection to another living being, as you can see it die without a host. When Shepard gets attacked by one, it latches onto him to become a subpar weapon only slightly more useful than the Hive Hand. From then on, the rest can't latch on and just die on the floor instead. Then we have the
giant enemy crab,
the Voltigore. It's big, it's dumb, it has a BFG in its body, and it's the centerpiece of the absolute worst part of any Half-Life game. You get to fight their babies too. I don't know what came first, this thing or the 20 redundant weapons in this game, but they managed to balance each other out pretty well. It's the big tanky enemy that every FPS needs. Playing against it feels a lot like fighting a Baron of Hell in Doom 1. Barons don't fucking explode, though. Next up is the Pit Worm. Not a lot to say about this thing. We only see one, and it's not exactly somewhere useful for the invasion. They just wanted a level like Blast Pit. You can shoot it in the eye, and it screams like a bird. That's it. Of course, one big knockoff of the tentacle wasn't enough, so Gearbox decided to make their big final boss into one as well. This has to be the most confusing thing in the damn game to me. Why does the Gene Worm look like this? Did they just forget? Did they run out of time? Are they related? The tentacles aren't exactly a major part of the greater storyline, and they sure as hell aren't smart enough to lead an invasion. But then again, who's to say the Gene Worm is? We know so little about this thing, we can't even tell if it's a leader or just the big thing you have to kill at the end because of its importance to Race X's overall goal. It doesn't talk like Nihilith did, and no, Randy's Doom 2 reference doesn't count. Instead, the great, unstated threat of the Gene Worm is terraforming. The strategy guide says that it can, quote, take any of our resources and assimilate them to the needs of their race, unquote. And while we do see elements of Zen infestation, similar to the environments of Half-Life Alyx, the closest we get to Race X influence is the Gene Worm's big portal, and maybe some of these spore pod things we can grapple on. The Gene Worm is also capable of using its own portals to bring in shock troopers, but they were already able to just pop up in front of the player at will, so yeah? It's bizarre. And speaking of teleportation, the creatures most important to our understanding of Race X and how it works are so easy to overlook that I honestly didn't know they were meant to be alive until recently. Remember these little balls of light that pop up on occasion? They aren't just there to lead you down paths and make the world feel more active. These things are called Sprites, and they are, somehow, the key to Race X's activity on Earth. We first see the Sprites when Shepard visits Zen in the chapter We Are Not Alone. Here they appear from a purple portal under a small platform and slowly fly up to a more familiar Zen portal above. We'll come back to the portals later, so keep this area in mind. Throughout the rest of the game, Adrian comes across the Sprites a number of times, always floating along the same way he is going until we see them fly into the Gene Worm's portal at the end. Now, in most of these appearances, they're around portals of some kind, including G-Man's. And speaking of, we see something very close to an unused variant of the Sprites in G-Man's Wild Ride at the end. Now's a good time to mention that since Valve has spent the last 20 years ignoring opposing force as much as they can, anything the G-Man does here probably doesn't have any bearing on the rest of the series. I mean, I'd love to see his cell phone return, but I wouldn't hold my breath. Anyway, Sprites have a very clear connection to teleportation. Hell, they look a lot like the particle effects used during the Resonance Cascade. A look at the Prima guide confirms this, or at least confirms that Drill Instructor Sharp agrees with me. Yeah, remember that minor character from the fucking boot camp?
My suggestion to you is to get your ass down to the training center and report to Drill Instructor Sharp ASAP!
All right, maggot, listen up! I don't care what your previous outfit was like, but around here we do things my way! Follow my instructions carefully, and by the end of the day I'll have you eating danger and crapping victory!
He wrote the strategy guide, and that's why it has bits like this.
Not too long ago I sat in at a top-secret meeting at an undisclosed location with several of the most powerful men in the world. Needless to say, a lesser man would have been intimidated, but I managed to take it all in stride.
You heard that right. Depending on your view of the Half-Life timeline, this random meathead drill sergeant could have met Bill Clinton, George Bush, or President Keemstar to talk about the fucking Gene Worm. And I don't care what anyone says, that's canon. Oh, and that's it for the Sprites, too. So this is where we exit the realm of officially released information and have to start speculating a bit. I'm going to refer to the evidence whenever I can, but everything from here on isn't fact, it's just my best guess. First, where did Race X come from? Well, somewhere purple and green, it seems. We never visit the Race X homeworld and never get a glimpse of it beyond the Gene Worm's portal and, I believe, this purple portal from earlier. We see the same green coloration, and with how intentional this looks, I have to assume that this portal was created by Race X to access Zen, and in turn get to more worlds. Zen is referred to as the border world for a reason. It's not really a place people are meant to live and stay, but it's often used in teleportation as a relay point throughout the series. Think of it as a shitty hallway, like the kind you'd see in a seedy hotel, but for the universe. Or multiverse, who knows? The reason this purple portal hovers in place above the void is because the Sprites that use it don't need solid ground. I think this points to Race X using pre-established gateways to Zen, as well as the same crystal technology humanity uses to send the Sprites to Earth, and then use them to establish a larger and more permanent gateway to our world on the other side. From there, they bring in the Gene Worm and begin to change our planet to suit their needs. But how do the aliens we fight get to Earth, I hear you asking? Well, according to Randy himself, it's built in. They can just do it. Naturally. I'm guessing the reason they need the Gene Worm, then, is more to do with long-term survival, rather than their only method to reliably teleport to Earth. Next question. What happened to Race X? Why don't we see them in any other games? Well, as for the other expansions, they all take place before Race X has any significant presence, with most of Opposing Force taking place after Gordon's already gone to Zen. And as for the sequels, we can assume that having their monster mash get graveyard smashed by one grunt didn't do a whole lot for their morale. Any stragglers remaining on Earth probably would have been wiped out by the Combine. I mean, really, they never stood much of a chance long term. We might have seen them in more games had Gearbox continued making them, but, I mean, we didn't get so much as a reference in any of the other expansions, so no point speculating there. And as far as the big burning questions go, that about does it. So that's it. Thank you all for watching. Remember to like and...
You dead!
What?
You hear me? Dead!
Oh,
What is your major malfunction, dirtbag?
Okay, Christ, I'll do it. Geez, talking to my own fucking videos. That hasn't been funny since the 2000s. Anyway, there's not a ton of pre-release information on Race X, and even less that we haven't already covered. Reused AI, mind control helmets, they exist because Gearbox wanted to make their own gameplay, all that stuff. What we do have are a whole bunch of fun facts. On the topic of reused AI, pit drones will attack headcrabs, while the shock trooper attacks alien grunts and gargantuas. This is presumably because, when copying over code from Half-Life 1's enemies, Gearbox didn't touch the Nemesis function, which is used to make NPCs target other NPCs to the exclusion of the player. In these cases, bull squids will always kill headcrabs first, and soldiers will always attack these enemies. It's hard to force most of these encounters to see them in action during regular gameplay, but this scene on the dam really makes it stick out. Speaking of shock troopers, we have an early screenshot showing them with orange skin, and Gearbox used Greedo noises from Star Wars as placeholders during development. We don't have any pre-release stuff for the Voltigores, so instead, I'll just tell you that most of the voices in this game were done by Duke Nukem.
Government cover-ups were not in my job description.
Squad, quiet down!
Damn, those alien bastards are gonna pay for shooting up my ride.
Oh man, where could my pollywog pal be anyway?
The pit drone and the chapter surrounding it is full of references. You have the valve, the gearbox, the Star Wars trash compactor, and the way it melts like the Wicked Witch of the West. That one might be an idea planted in my head by Shepard's mind, but now it's in all of yours as well. They also planned a second phase for the boss in the sewers.
There was this one chase scene with the pit worm where it was chasing you through the tunnels and stuff. That was probably the most significant part of the game that we cut, because we worked on it, we got it to a certain point, and it just wasn't quite working out the way that
really
wanted.
ambitious.
It was pretty ambitious.
So, but yeah, there was a moment where you'd beat it and you'd basically flush it down the toilet, which means it wasn't dead, and the whole floor would collapse, and you'd end up in these tunnels, these sewer tunnels, and it would be chasing you, crawling through the tunnels. And
cool.
The idea was you'd be running away, or maybe you'd be on the back of kind of like a tram-like device and shooting off of the back of its deck. But you know what killed us on that? We wanted the tunnels to be round. There was other problems with it too. Like, it was just going to be exciting, you know, but mostly it was going to be a rail ride. So it deserved to be cut. It wasn't going to be that great. But because we cut it early, we put all of the development attention that would have gone on that back into the pitworm itself. So that first half of the originally designed boss fight became the entire boss fight, and was really gratifying.
And I've saved the best for last. In addition to two fairly standard unused designs for the sprites, we have this one. Definitely a joke, maybe a placeholder, and by far my favorite thing in a Gearbox game. Someone should make a mod to put it back in the game. And that's all for Race X. A weird set of creatures to be sure, but that's what happens when a publisher hires completely different developers to milk the first success they've ever had in the FPS genre. There's a reason Sierra got bought out, and then the company who bought them out got bought out to form the hellscape we know today as Activision Blizzard. And thank you very much for watching.
We have decided to convey you somewhere you can do no possible harm, and where no harm can come to you. I'm sure you can imagine there are worse alternatives.